The defeat suffered by the Russians had thrown their army into such confusion that all who had escaped the disaster of Austerlitz hastened to reach Galicia in order to get away from the victor. The rout was complete, the French took a very great number of prisoners, and found the roads covered with abandoned guns and baggage. The Emperor of Russia, who had believed he was marching to a certain victory, withdrew, heartbroken, authorizing his ally Francis II to negotiate with Napoleon. On the very evening of the battle, the Emperor of Austria, to save his unhappy country from complete ruin, had asked for an interview with the Emperor of the French, and, with Napoleon's consent, he halted at the village of Nasiedlovitz. The interview took place on the 4th, near the mill of Poleni, between the lines of the Austrian and French outposts. I was present at this memorable conference. Napoleon, having set out very early from the chateau of Austerlitz, accompanied by his numerous staff, arrived first at the meeting place, dismounted, and was walking around a bivouac when, seeing the Emperor of Austria arrive, he went to him and embraced him cordially, a spectacle well calculated to inspire philosophical reflections. An Emperor of Germany, coming to humble himself and beg for peace from a little Corsican gentleman, lately a second lieutenant of artillery, whom his talents, fortunate circumstances, and the courage of the French armies had raised to the summit of power and made the arbiter of Europe's destiny. Napoleon did not abuse the position in which the Emperor of Austria found himself. He was affectionate and extremely polite, as far as we could judge from the respectful distance at which the two staffs stood. An armistice was concluded between the two sovereigns, who agreed to send plenipotentiaries on both sides to Brno, in order to negotiate there a treaty of peace between France and Austria. The emperors embraced again as they parted. The German sovereign returned to Nasiedlovitz, and Napoleon came back to spend the night at the chateau of Austerlitz. He spent 2 days there, during which he granted Commander Massey and me our farewell audience, charging us to recount to Marshal Augereau what we had seen. At the same time, the Emperor handed us dispatches for the court of Bavaria, which had returned to Munich, and informed us that Marshal Augereau had left Bregenz and that we would find him at Ulm. We made our way back to Vienna and continued our journey traveling night and day, despite the snow falling in thick flakes. I shall enter here into no detail about the political changes that were the result of the Battle of Austerlitz and the Peace of Pressburg. The Emperor had gone to Vienna, then to Munich, where he was to attend the marriage of his stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, with the daughter of the King of Bavaria. It appears that the dispatches we were charged to deliver to that court concerned this marriage, for we were received there in the best possible manner. Nevertheless, we remained only a few hours in Munich and reached the town of Ulm, where we found the 7th Corps and Marshal Augereau. We spent a fortnight there. To bring the 7th Corps gradually closer to Electoral Hesse, an intimate ally of Prussia, Napoleon ordered it to move from Ulm to Heidelberg, where we arrived toward the end of December and began the year 1806. After a short stay in that city, the 7th Corps proceeded to Darmstadt, capital of the Landgrave of Hesse-Darmstadt, a prince strongly attached to the King of Prussia, both by blood ties and by politics. Although this monarch, in accepting Hanover, had concluded a treaty of alliance with Napoleon, he had done so with reluctance and dreaded the approach of the French army. Marshal Augereau, before bringing his troops into the country of Darmstadt, thought it proper to inform the Landgrave by a letter which he charged me to carry to him. The journey was only 15 leagues. I made it in a single night, but on arriving in Darmstadt, I learned that the Landgrave, to whom it had been insinuated that the French wished to seize his person, had just left that residence to withdraw to another part of his states, whence he could easily take refuge in Prussia. This departure annoyed me greatly. However, having learned that the Landgravine was still at the palace, I asked to be presented to her. This princess, whose person greatly resembled the portraits of Empress Catherine of Russia, had, like her, a masculine character, very great capacity, and all the qualities necessary to govern a vast empire. She therefore ruled the prince her husband, as well as his states. She was, in every respect, what one may call a masterful woman. Seeing in my hands the letter addressed to the Landgrave by Marshal Augereau, she took it without ceremony, as if it had been for herself. She then told me, with the greatest frankness, that it was on her advice that the Landgrave, her husband, had gone away at the approach of the French, but that she undertook to bring him back if the Marshal would give her the assurance that he had no orders to attempt anything against that prince's liberty. I understood that the arrest and death of the Duke of Enghien frightened all the princes who thought that Napoleon might have grounds of complaint against them or their alliances. I protested, as much as I could, the purity of the French government's intentions, and offered to return to Heidelberg to seek from Marshal Augereau the assurances the princess desired, which she accepted. I set out and returned the next day with a letter from the Marshal, couched in terms so benevolent that the Landgravine, after saying, "I trust to the honor of a French Marshal," went at once to Gießen, where the Landgrave was, brought him back to Darmstadt, and both received Marshal Augereau perfectly when he came to establish his headquarters in that city. The Marshal was so grateful to them for the confidence they had had in him that a few months later, when the Emperor, reorganizing all the small states of Europe, reduced their number to 32, of which he formed the Confederation of the Rhine, Augereau not only managed to keep the Landgrave of Darmstadt in being, he obtained for him the title of Grand Duke, and so greatly enlarged his states that the population was raised from scarcely 500,000 souls to more than 1,000,000 inhabitants. The new Grand Duke joined his troops a few months later to ours against Russia, requesting that they serve in Marshal Augereau's corps. Thus, this prince owed his preservation and his elevation to the courage of his wife. Although I was still very young at this time, I thought that Napoleon was committing a great mistake by reducing the number of the small principalities of Germany. In fact, in the former wars against France, the 800 princes of the Germanic body could not act together. Some supplied only a company, others a platoon, several a half-soldier, so that the combining of these various contingents composed an army entirely lacking in coherence and breaking up at the first reverse. But when Napoleon had reduced to 32 the number of the principalities, there was a beginning of centralization in Germany's forces. The sovereigns preserved and enlarged formed a small, well-constituted army. That was the Emperor's aim, in the hope of thus using for his profit all the military resources of that country, which did, in fact, occur as long as we had successes, but at the first reverse, the 32 sovereigns, having come to an understanding, united against France, and their coalition with Russia overthrew Emperor Napoleon, who was thus punished for not having followed the ancient policy of the kings of France. We spent part of the winter at Darmstadt in festivities, balls, and galas. The Grand Duke's troops were commanded by a respectable general, von Storck. He had a son of my age, a lieutenant of the guards, a charming young man with whom I formed a close friendship, and of whom I shall speak again. We were only 10 leagues from Frankfurt on Main. This city, still free, and whose commerce made it immensely rich, had long been the hotbed of all intrigues hatched against France, and the starting point of all the false news circulating in Germany against us. Thus, the day after the Battle of Austerlitz, and when the rumor spread that there had been an engagement, the result of which was unknown, the inhabitants of Frankfurt asserted that the Russians were the victors. Several newspapers pushed their hatred so far as to say that the disasters of our army had been so great that not a single Frenchman had escaped. The Emperor, to whom everything was reported, dissembled until the moment when, foreseeing the possibility of a rupture with Prussia, he gradually brought his armies nearer to that kingdom's borders. Wishing then to punish the impertinence of the Frankfurters, he ordered Marshal Augereau to leave Darmstadt unexpectedly and go to establish himself with all his army corps in Frankfurt and on its territory. The Emperor's order specified that the city, on the day of the entry of our troops, must give, as a welcome, 1 louis d'or to each soldier, 2 to corporals, 3 to sergeants, 10 to second lieutenants, and so on. The inhabitants were, moreover, to lodge and feed the troops, and to pay table expenses, namely, to the marshal 600 francs per day, to divisional generals 400, to brigade generals 200, to colonels 100, the Senate was required to send every month 1 million francs to the imperial treasury in Paris. The authorities of Frankfurt, terrified by so exorbitant a contribution, ran to the French envoy, but he, to whom Napoleon had given instructions, replied, "You claimed that not a single Frenchman had escaped the Russian steel. Emperor Napoleon has therefore wished to put you in a position to count those who compose a single corps of the Grande Armée. There are 6 others of equal strength, and the Guard will come afterward." This response, reported to the inhabitants, plunged them into consternation, for, however immense their wealth, they would have been ruined if this state of things had lasted some time. But Marshal Augereau, having appealed to the Emperor's clemency on behalf of the Frankfurters, he received authorization to do as he wished, so that he took it upon himself to keep in the city only his staff and a single battalion. The other troops were distributed in the neighboring principalities. From that moment, joy returned, and the inhabitants, to show their gratitude to Marshal Augereau, gave him a great number of festivities. I was lodged with a rich merchant named Monsieur Chameau. I spent nearly 8 months with him, during which he and his family were full of attentions for me. While we were in Frankfurt, a very painful accident that befell an officer of the 7th Corps earned me a double mission, the first part of which was very trying, and the second very pleasant, even brilliant. Following a fever that affected his brain, Lieutenant N of the 7th Chasseurs fell completely into childhood, and Marshal Augereau instructed me to take this poor young man to Paris, first to Murat, who had always taken an interest in him there, and then to Quercy, if Murat asked me to do so. As I had not seen my mother since my departure for the Austerlitz campaign, and knew that she was not far from Saint-Céré, at the Chateau of Bras, which my father had bought some time before his death, I gladly accepted a mission that, while allowing me to be of service to Marshal Murat, would let me spend a few days with my mother. The Marshal lent me a good calèche, and I set out for Paris. But the heat and insomnia so inflamed my poor comrade that, passing from idiocy to fury, he nearly killed me with a blow from a carriage key. I never made a more disagreeable journey. At last, I reached Paris and took Lieutenant N to Murat, who was spending the fine season at the Chateau of Neuilly. The Marshal asked me to complete the task I had begun and to take N to Quercy. I agreed, in the hope of seeing my mother again, while pointing out that I could not leave for 24 hours, since Marshal Augereau had entrusted me with dispatches for the Emperor, whom I went to rejoin at Rambouillet, where I presented myself officially the same day. I do not know what the dispatches I carried contained, but they made the Emperor very uneasy. He summoned Monsieur de Talleyrand and left with him for Paris, where he ordered me to follow and to present myself to Marshal Duroc that evening. I obeyed. I had been waiting for a long time in one of the salons of the Tuileries when Marshal Duroc, coming out of the Emperor's office, whose door he left ajar, ordered an orderly officer, aloud, to prepare to set out post-haste on a long mission. But Napoleon exclaimed, "Duroc, that's unnecessary. Since we have Marbot here who is going to rejoin Augereau, he can push on to Berlin, for which Frankfurt is halfway." Accordingly, Marshal Duroc instructed me to prepare to go to Berlin with the Emperor's dispatches. This annoyed me, because it meant giving up my visit to embrace my mother, but I had no choice. I hurried to Neuilly to inform Murat. As for me, believing my new mission to be very urgent, I returned to the Tuileries, but Marshal Duroc gave me until the next morning. I was there at daybreak, and was put off until evening, then from evening until the next day, and so on for more than 8 days. However, I was patient, because each time I presented myself, Marshal Duroc kept me only a moment, which allowed me to run about Paris. Duroc had given me quite a large sum, intended to renew my uniforms completely, so that I could present myself properly before the King of Prussia, into whose hands I was to deliver, myself, a letter from the Emperor. You see that Napoleon neglected no detail when it was a matter of enhancing the French soldier in the eyes of foreigners. At last, I set out, after receiving the dispatches and the Emperor's instructions, who especially recommended that I carefully examine the Prussian troops, their bearing, their weapons, their horses, and so on. Monsieur de Talleyrand gave me a packet for Monsieur Laforest, the French ambassador in Berlin, at whose residence I was to stay. On arriving at Mainz, which at that time formed part of French territory, I learned that Marshal Augereau was in Wiesbaden. I went there and surprised him greatly by telling him that I was going to Berlin by order of the Emperor. He congratulated me and ordered me to continue my route. I travelled night and day in the superb weather of July, and arrived in Berlin a little tired. At that time, the roads of Prussia were not yet paved, so one almost always rolled at a walk over shifting sand in which the carriages sank deeply and raised unbearable clouds of dust. Monsieur Laforest received me admirably. I lodged at the embassy and was presented to the king and queen, as well as to the princes and princesses. On receiving the emperor's letter, the King of Prussia seemed very moved. He was a tall, handsome man, whose face expressed kindness, but he lacked that animation that denotes a firm character. The queen was truly very beautiful. Only one thing detracted from her looks. She always wore a thick cravat to hide, they said, a rather pronounced goiter which, having been tormented by doctors, had opened and discharged a purulent matter, especially when this princess danced, which was her favorite amusement. Otherwise, her person was full of grace, and her intelligent, majestic features expressed a firm will. I was received very graciously, and as the reply I was to carry back to the emperor was delayed for more than a month, so difficult did it seem to compose, the queen was kind enough to invite me to the festivities and balls she gave during my stay. Of all the members of the royal family, the one who treated me with the most kindness, at least in appearance, was Prince Louis, the king's nephew. I had been warned that he detested the French, and especially their emperor. But as he was passionately fond of the military profession, he questioned me constantly about the siege of Genoa, the battles of Marengo and Austerlitz, as well as about the organization of our army. Prince Louis of Prussia was a splendid man, and in mind, ability, and character, he was the only one of the royal family who bore any resemblance to the great Frederick. I became acquainted with several people at court, and especially with officers whom I followed every day to parade and maneuvers. I therefore passed my time very pleasantly in Berlin, where our ambassador overwhelmed me with attentions, but I eventually noticed that he wanted to make me play, in a delicate affair, a role that did not suit me, and I became very reserved. But let us examine Prussia's position with regard to Napoleon. The dispatches I brought related to this, as I later learned. By accepting from Napoleon the gift of the Electorate of Hanover, the patrimony of the reigning family of England, the cabinet of Berlin had alienated not only the anti-French party, but almost the entire Prussian nation. German pride was indeed wounded by the successes won by the French over the Austrians, and Prussia also feared to see its commerce ruined as a result of the war that the London cabinet had just declared upon it. The Queen and Prince Louis sought to take advantage of this effervescence of feeling to bring the king to make war on France by joining Russia, which, although abandoned by Austria, still hoped to take revenge for the defeat of Austerlitz. Emperor Alexander was further encouraged in his projects against France by a Pole, his favorite aide-de-camp, Prince Czartoryski. However, the anti-French party, which grew daily, had not yet been able to bring the King of Prussia to break with Napoleon, but, feeling supported by Russia, this party redoubled its efforts and cleverly took advantage of the mistakes Napoleon made in placing his brother Louis on the throne of Holland and in naming himself Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, an act presented to the King of Prussia as a step toward the re-establishment of Charlemagne's empire. Napoleon, it was said, wanted to settle matters by reducing all the sovereigns of Germany to the rank of his vassals. These assertions, greatly exaggerated, nonetheless produced a great change in the king's mind, and his conduct toward France became from then on so equivocal that it led Napoleon to write to him with his own hand, without following the usual course of diplomacy, to ask him, "Are you for me or against me?" Such was the sense of the letter I had delivered to the king. His council, wishing to gain time to complete the armaments, delayed the reply, and this was the cause that kept me so long in Berlin. At last, in August, a general explosion took place against France, and one saw the Queen, Prince Louis, the nobility, the army, the entire population, demand war with loud cries. The king allowed himself to be carried along, but as, although resolved to break the peace, he still retained a faint hope of avoiding hostilities, it appears that in his reply to the emperor, he undertook to disarm if the latter brought back to France all the troops he had in Germany, which Napoleon wished to do only when Prussia had disarmed, so that one was turning in a vicious circle from which one could emerge only by war. Before my departure from Berlin, I witnessed the delirium to which hatred of Napoleon drove the Prussian nation, ordinarily so calm. The officers I knew no longer dared speak to me or salute me. Several Frenchmen were insulted by the populace. Finally, the gendarmes of the noble guard carried their boasting so far as to come and sharpen the blades of their sabres on the stone steps of the French ambassador's residence. I hastily took the road to Paris, carrying with me much information about what was going on in Prussia. Passing through Frankfurt, I found Marshal Augereau very sad. He had just learned of the death of his wife, a good and excellent person whom he greatly regretted, and whose loss was felt by the entire staff, for she had been excellent to us. On arriving in Paris, I delivered to the emperor the autograph reply of the King of Prussia. After reading it, he questioned me about what I had seen in Berlin. When I told him that the gendarmes of the guard had come to sharpen their sabres on the steps of the French embassy, he quickly put his hand on the hilt of his sword and exclaimed indignantly, "Those insolent braggarts will soon learn that our arms are in good condition." My mission being then completed, I returned to Marshal Augereau and spent the whole month of September in Frankfurt, where we prepared for war, while continuing to amuse ourselves as much as possible, for we thought that, nothing being more uncertain than the lives of soldiers, they must hasten to enjoy them. That concludes the 21st part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.